Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marjorie Chorlins. I'm the Vice President for European Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. For those of you who are not familiar with the Chamber, we are the largest business association, certainly in the U.S., possibly in the world. We represent the interests of 3 million companies of all sizes and sectors and regions across the U.S. We also have a network of 117 American Chambers of Commerce, or AmChams, around the world. I'm only going to speak very briefly and then turn it over to Esther. I think for both of us, the best use of your time will be for us to engage in as much question and answer as possible. I am working under the assumption that most folks in the room are at least aware at the most basic level of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations, or TTIP. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I will say simply that the negotiations began in July 2013. We will enter the 15th round of negotiations next week in New York. And contrary to earlier estimations that we might conclude this deal on the proverbial one tank of gas, or even one tanker of gas, we are unlikely to conclude these negotiations before the end of this calendar year or the end of this administration. I don't think that's a shock to you, is it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Look, the Chamber has been advocating for these negotiations since before they were actually formally launched. We started in late 2011 calling for, at a minimum, a reduction of all tariffs on goods, both industrial goods and agricultural products, between the U.S. and the EU, on the grounds that even though tariffs are relatively low between our two economies, there is nonetheless substantial benefit to be gained in terms of economic growth, as well as the potential for job creation. We eventually expanded our view to encompass a much broader set of negotiating objectives, in part because both economies were still struggling with the sort of tail end, or maybe the midsection, of the financial crisis, and we felt there would be substantial additional gain to be gleaned from a more comprehensive agreement. So the Chamber began calling, even before the establishment of the high-level working group on jobs and growth, which was a task force assigned to look at whether or not a deal with the EU would make sense. Even before that working group was established, we began calling for a comprehensive negotiation. When we began talking about what we were looking for in these negotiations, we spoke of a comprehensive, ambitious, and high-standard negotiation. I'm going to refresh my memory and read very quickly for you the key elements of what we meant by each of those aspects of the negotiation. By comprehensive, we meant that the agreement should cover trade in industrial goods, food and agricultural goods, services, investment, government procurement, protection of intellectual property rights, and regulatory issues. We also argued that there should be no exclusion for any sector or commodities. In terms of ambition, we talked about an agreement that would address emerging opportunities in the 21st century economy, including such things as trade in digital goods and services. Excuse me. Hang on. Just talking about it wears me out. As well as the long-standing challenges that we face in our economic relationship, most notably in terms of technical barriers to trade and so-called sanitary and phytosanitary issues, things related to agriculture. In terms of how we define high standard, we mean highest possible standards for others to emulate in areas such as investment, intellectual property rights, competition policy, treatment of state-owned enterprises, and localization requirements. I'm not going to dig further into each of those areas. I'm happy to do so in Q&A. The one thing I would say as I reflect on the negotiations, or at least the objectives that we set out, comprehensive, ambitious, and high standard, the other qualifier that I would add to that list is commercially relevant. One of the challenges we've had in these negotiations is ensuring that as we look ahead, as we have moved forward with these negotiations, that what we're really focusing on will in fact have the greatest commercial benefit to both sides. We're not in the business of negotiating an agreement for the agreement's sake. We're not in the business of seeing a negotiation half completed or what some have termed an early harvest. In order for our member companies to feel that this negotiation is actually worthwhile and worth supporting, it will require ample political support. It has to be commercially relevant. There have to be demonstrable benefits in terms of reduced costs through closer regulatory alignment where possible, through reductions of tariff and non-tariff barriers, and through, again, the achievement of the highest possible standards. We are, as I said, at the threshold of the 15th round of negotiations. I think it's fair to say that we have come through each successive round of negotiations with the negotiators effectively saying, yes, we've made progress. There's been workmanlike progress, particularly at the technical level. But we have yet to see that really significant breakthrough that we might all hope for that would allow us to turn and then say, well, we're entering that phase of the negotiation where we're really talking about the hard trade-offs between our economies. We are very, very far away from that. We're far away from that, not least because of the really, how should I say, deteriorating support for trade on both sides of the Atlantic. We saw this phenomenon really begin to take hold in Europe even before we had it here in the U.S. But if anyone questions the seriousness with which trade is being debated and attacked in this country, you need only look at the clips from Monday night's debate to really get a sense for that. So we find ourselves in a somewhat odd situation where what should be a relatively high priority, high visibility, and highly successful round of negotiation writ large is actually struggling. It's struggling because both sides, I would argue, have made missteps along the way. It's struggling because some of the issues we're dealing with are 25 or 30 years or longer in the making. That makes me sad because that means I've been here that long. But it's struggling because of the public sentiment turning against trade. It's also struggling, frankly, because Europe finds itself confronted with a number of other very significant challenges: the migration issue, the terrorism issue, the decision by the UK to pull out of the European Union. There are a number of challenges that Brussels is facing that I think make it very, very difficult for some of the toughest political choices to be made. Now, that's my perspective from this side of the Atlantic. I'm sure Esther has her own thoughts as well. Suffice it to say, and then I will turn it over to Esther, from our standpoint, the business community in the U.S. continues to fully support these negotiations. I would say that if we were to quote-unquote cut a deal based on what's on the table today, the private sector would not support these negotiations because, frankly, there is insufficient progress in some of the critical issues. We've also found ourselves taking a step backward on some key issues, investment being most notable among them, but we can talk about that as well. Bottom line, we're still very supportive. We want to see this move forward. As far as timing, we know there'll be another round, as I said, next week. Whether there will be yet a follow-on round before the end of the calendar year remains to be seen. We know there will continue to be technical discussions between the two sides, but what the future holds beyond that, I think, is really anyone's guess. So why don't I turn it over to Esther.